Belief in socialism seems to spring from the error of anthropomorphism. The human brain evolved to recognize patterns and compare them by analogy. Since one's own life and actions are directed by conscious motivations, we too easily assume all effective action is motivated by conscious actors. Thus, social problems are more effectively solved by conscientiously motivated central planning. The far greater fecundity of market spontaneous order under a system of property rights is extremely counterintuitive. And I realize that we have touched upon it in different forms, but this specific notion of anthropomorphism, does it have any validity or not?
I think there's an even simpler way of looking at it, which is if you're living in a very small social group, and Jonathan referred to Simon Baron-Cohen's work, which is in a general topic of what's called theory of mind, our ability to read minds, not in the spooky sense, but in the sense of being able to infer the intentions, beliefs, and desires of other people. Crucial if you're living in a small social group, you're reading the minds of the people around you all the time, and you're discussing what to do. There are lots of problems to solve in that very small social group. You're discussing what to do amongst people that you know. And so in that environment, and those are not dynamic environments, remember. I mean, the kinds of increases in everything that we've seen in the last 200 years are historically very novel, right? In that kind of environment, the decisions that you make with other people do have an impact on what you actually do. And so, sure, I mean, there's some anthropomorphism, and I think there's something to that comment, but I think even more simply, we evolved in a case where things that I thought and intended to do actually had an effect on what my social group did.
Anybody else? Okay. Are there any questions? Do we have mics around? Okay. In the corner, Fred Smith.
One of the things that seems like we've maybe overlooked is that Adam Smith himself drew attention to two human evolved traits. Self-interest, that we understand very well, and we've talked about, is sort of a negative self-serving trait. But he also talked about the empathy, the thing we've talked about. It seems to me that capitalism does, but is unappreciated in its ability to synthesize those two traits. One, the self-interest gives you a motivational drive to do something successful, but the empathy allows you to read your business partners, your customers, your workers, and so on much more effectively. And then, in effect, capitalism is a tool for honing the two basic evolutionary instincts of mankind. It hasn't been able to get appreciation for that, and I think that's a mystery in itself. Why hasn't it?
Yeah. No, I think that is certainly true. When I teach courses to my business students, I ask them, how much of your day do you spend cooperating and how much do you spend competing? Because people seem to think that capitalism is all about competition, and of course that's an essential element, but it's overwhelmingly about cooperation. It's ways of creating cooperation on vast scales. And so, yes, I think it gets a bad rap, very much for the reason that Leda gave in her main talk, which is we're not just focused on what someone actually did for us. We really are trying to figure out, did he mean to do it? Because that's what we need to know if he's friend or foe. And capitalism just ignores that kind of moral attribution.
I wanted to give a shout out for being a female and a libertarian and the systematizing empathy thing. I'm not going to deny being systematizing by any means. That would be insane and nobody would believe me. But I grew up in Montgomery County, and I didn't even know the term private sector growing up. So the things, it was actually, the idea of individual liberty was obvious to me, right? But the idea that extended to anything economic was not obvious to me. And one of the first things that made me start thinking differently was actually a work of human ethology called The Territorial Imperative, where they mentioned that in the Soviet Union on these collectivized farms, that only 3% of the land was being privately farmed, but it was producing 50 to 75% of all the produce in the Soviet Union. And I thought to myself, that would be really, if to make everything collectivized, I would be starving people. That would be really bad. I don't want to starve people. I mean, it was an empathy response. And there were several other empathy responses, like when, I had empathy for Hank Rearden when I saw things from his point of view. I think that there's, and then as I learned more and more and more and more about how markets work, I don't even understand, if you really understand it and you think about the modern world and how it's created wealth for everybody, I mean, in places where there are free markets and so forth, then to me, you're being incredibly lacking in empathy to not want to help freedom go forward. I mean, what kind of person would do that? What kind of person would want to put us back into a situation where everybody is equally starving? It's horrible. So I just wanted to give a shout out there for libertarian empathy.
Okay, but I want to point out that you were moved by an argument and a statistic.
That's true. That's the not denying.
There's a question right in the back.
You talked about the difference
Who are you,
between,
please?
Oh, sorry.
A name, please.
Arnold Kling.
Okay.
You talked about the issue of a zero sum and how that's sort of not a good way of looking at things. And certainly over very long periods of time, wealth is not a zero sum game. But short term and immediate status is always a zero sum game. And I wonder if you'd comment on sort of status as an issue or a motivator for people in thinking about politics.
So,
That's right.
yeah, that's a very important point. So, material goods are one set of things that people like and benefit from. And for our hunter-gatherer ancestors, and also for us, because we're running many of the same programs in our heads, or all the same programs in our heads, positional goods were a major part of what a positional good, for those who don't know, is one in which they're inherently zero. So a dominance rank, for example, is you get benefits based from what your position is in the rank, and that's inherently zero sum because you go up, somebody else has to come down. And whereas material goods are not like that. So we are swimming in there's dog bakeries, and I still have moral qualms about even walking by a dog bakery, even though I like dogs, right? But it just seems, anyway. But the underlying thing about positional goods is that they were important. What mate you got, how much people would sacrifice for you, had to do with your status, right? And your ability to have influence on outcomes, on conflicts that you cared about. So there is this. It's a very interesting emotion, envy, with a scholar named Schenk. I don't know how to pronounce the German exactly as I ought, but anyway, he wrote a book on it. It's extremely ubiquitous kind of phenomenon. It's people, nobody wants to admit to it, but if you look as an anthropologist, if you look at small scale societies like, little Greek villages where the land is extremely unproductive and there's all these sort of rock, just to get the rocks off the soil. Anyway, somebody else's gain in your little village is a loss to others, right? And so they have all sorts of evil eye notion. You don't want to say anything good about your child or yourself. There's this witchcraft accusations. But even in the modern world, a lot of so there is empathy for sure in the Occupy Wall Street, but there's also a kind of vituperative desire to pull down. Okay, and that comes from thinking that, and probably realistically, that people who are more prosperous and productive enjoy higher status, and that is just intrinsically an assault on the human mind. And so